That's good.
I'm not. I don't see. They have for schooling and that type of thing. So my dad.
Because when our ancestors, or when we came from Japan to this land we call Canada,
you mentioned that we I did find a picture. I will be going around and finding out who wants to speak. Now this picture came from the C&D.
That we can get on these websites. So if you can help me out, that would be great. So once again, my name is Mika Fukuma.
Internment and coming east. It's got a few recipes, memorabilia, poetry. It's a real mix. It's a nice coffee book table.
We have a performance for you. First of all, a performance by Noriko Yamamoto, and then later Ayami Kai dancers.
There's also, you can fill out the quizzes before you can.
Yeah, lots of prizes. So they're just like
In this spirit, we acknowledge that the lands on which we operate are the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Wendat. We acknowledge
introducing one of my colleagues, Professor Damien Lee. Professor Lee is a member of the Fort William First Nation, an Ojibwa community located next to Thunder Bay in, of course, Ontario. Damien himself, he describes himself as a white man. He was adopted into his community as an infant. And today he is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and the Faculty of Arts here at Ryerson. I'm really delighted that he has joined us at Ryerson University.
I'm really happy to be here. I'm really happy to be a part of this day with you. And you know, in preparing to come here tonight, I have to admit I learned a lot about Japanese Canadian history in, you know, since the late 1800s and in what has become Canada, or what is currently Canada. So I'm really thrilled and I'm really happy to have the invitation again. Thank you for that. So I was asked to come.
A dual citizenship, or is it a very, very special something else?
It's a complex answer. There are some people who believe in an indigenous, I'll use the word citizenship. So indigenous peoples have their own legal systems that are informed by and speak back to Canadian legal systems, but they're also of their own kind, sui generis, right? And in those spaces, your question actually resonates in different ways. So there are some people who will say, I'm a member or I'm a citizen of the Haudenosaunee or so Mohawk.
One of the things that I learned was before the government really got involved recently, the indigenous people were a matriarchy, but now it seems to be more of a patriarchy.
Yeah.
So what is an indigenous government? Because there's a...
And so the question being, what is indigenous governance? When we look at it through a gendered lens, and you know, there are times that we hear stories about matriarchal governance systems. Part of the answer there is that there are different indigenous nations in North America, and they do governance differently. So, for example, a lot of Haudenosaunee or Mohawk communities will be matriarchal by their governance design. I'm really happy to be here, and I have the property. I'm learning so much just by preparing, and also just. I'm looking forward to the rest of the night to learn some more. So thank you again.
Okay, so question 1. In 1867, eligibility to vote in a federal election was restricted to male British subjects who were at least 21 years old and met property qualifications. True or false? True. Of course, this was not a straightforward proposition, as provinces were developing differently. At Confederation, the British North America Act stated that control of the federal franchise would remain a privilege. Black Canadian males had the right to vote prior to Confederation and after Confederation. True or false? That's true. I sometimes hear were Japanese Canadians disenfranchised in British Columbia. Anyone know the answer? 1895. The Provincial Voters Act was amended for the purpose of disenfranchising the Japanese. The Chinese and indigenous peoples had already been disenfranchised by this act in 1872. British Columbia was not the only province that disenfranchised Japanese Canadians. True or false? False. BC was the only province that disenfranchised the Japanese. However, BC was not the only province that disenfranchised the Chinese. In 1908, Saskatchewan disenfranchised the Chinese. Who launched the first court challenge to the disenfranchisement of JCs? Anyone know the answer? I thought that was one of the easy ones. Okay. Tommy Homa. Manzo Nagano.
It's an important film. Damien earlier mentioned belonging, and forces us to, or prompts us to reconceptualize the framework within which we view history. And with this lens informed by Damien's comments, I'm going to watch the film, and I think I'll see new things and look at the history of this country quite differently. So please enjoy the film.
1942, I was 11. Got onto a train and boarded to Winnipeg, Manitoba.
When we were leaving Vancouver, I was wearing a red plaid skirt and a nice knitted pink sweater to say goodbye to my friends, almost like as I was going on a holiday.
We didn't know what Manitoba was like.
Where we went, there's nothing. Just nothing, just prairie.
The farmer comes and then look us over, just like in the old slave days. What the heck is this?
I wondered, why we ended up in Winnipeg. When you heard stories that we used to have a farm in British Columbia, and people said, well, why would you want to leave?
My parents were living in limbo. They didn't know what was going to happen next.
It was a difficult time, tragic time.
He's really good at doing these. is a fabulous venue. So again, we want to thank our lead sponsors.
Gratitude. I think that the whole settlement of redress is actually a kind of universal concept of really.
It's a great meeting, and I think we're all very happy.
I have your certificate. Redress was a campaign that we started in 1980. And the first half of it, today is 88. And the first half
the signing of the redress settlement with the federal government. The terms included $21,000 to each survivor, $12 million to a community fund, and $24 million for a race relations foundation.
This evening was so many people who bring back memories of the time that we had redress, and I'm so glad that they're all here. It's wonderful to be here this evening to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the redress settlement. And I think it's a great time to reflect on some of the moments that eventually led to a successful campaign.
My mother was born in Deep Bay, BC. My father was born in Victoria, BC, unceded Coast Salish territory. I would like to introduce to you
especially since it always wasn't taught in high school. Events like this gala refresh conversations in our history, not only
such prescient words. He said, "What you put in your head is the only thing that cannot be taken away." And he said that in the 30s, before the war, to my grandmother.
Strong, and we give them a reason to have a faith in the world. We pray to the West. As adults, we have a reason to pray for all of those who are like us, who have work to do in this world today.
If you like this event and you'd like to join the board and plan the next event, we have a lot of space for you. And we're very welcoming, and we're a pretty good group of people. So we'd love to see you join us anytime. Peace and love. Thank you, everybody.
Which was founded as part of the 1988 Redress Agreement, and the Federation of Canadian Lawyers, co-founded by America Matsu and Pamela Shin Doi, wife of Michael Doi. Present, representing the CRRF, is Dr. Lillian Ma. Where did I see Lillian? There's this wave of great-grandchildren of Tomokichi Homa, Atlee Homa. There's Atlee at the back.
Thank you, Kim. I just want to say a few words about Kim. She's been a board member of the Toronto NAJC for about 5 years. She's a Yonsei, 4th generation, on her maternal side, and she has a special interest in social justice, human rights, and right relations and Indigenous justice, and was a member of the National Human Rights Committee of the NAJC. She also has particular experience with intercultural LGBTQ+, Indigenous right relations, and anti-racist initiatives. And America herself attended over 10 consultations across Canada. She was very committed to the process, including she did attend the 2 that were here in Toronto at the Momiji Centre. She high achiever, achieving Sansei women. Presiding at the convocation was Chancellor Janice Fukakusa, and she is Ryerson's first female professor of law at the University of Alberta, Faculty of Law. Earlier this year, he was an academic visitor at the Faculty of Law in St. He's some of Canada's most important public law decisions, and is leading the legal historical research on landscapes of injustice, a large interdisciplinary partnership researching the dispossession of Japanese Canadians. Professor Adams is currently working on several book projects based on his...
But because I've learned so much about this history from some of its leaders, and maybe I'll just single out Art Mickey, who's a national treasure and been an important and critical mentor on our Landscapes of Injustice project. Landscapes of Injustice, which is listed on my title slide, is a really incredible collection of researchers and community members that have been looking at the dispossession of Japanese Canadians, as well as the internment, incarceration, and exile, in order to develop new lines of research and to get that research into the hands, I think, where it needs to be, into the community itself, but also into the broader Canadian public. So there'll be a traveling museum exhibit, which will begin in August of this year to tell this story. And I think perhaps most crucially, a set of school teaching lessons for grade 5 students that are already in operation across Canada to keep this history alive in the people that really matter to the future of this country, our school kids. Think about these institutions and these spaces as makers of Canadian constitutional law. I want to argue that these are not just fixed documents. They're flexible sets of ideals about how we live together well, and they require the demands of people and the imaginings in good faith of all of us. The Constitution is not just built by politicians. It is not just words on paper. It is sometimes built in adversity, in moments of constitutional failure. The Japanese Canadian community knows about those constitutional failures all too well. Tonight I want to focus some elements of the story that are less well known. I want to focus on the resistance of the Japanese Canadian community, their use of constitutional arguments to fight against. So I'm going to talk about 4 cases which help to define the constitutional failures of Canada and that deny Japanese Canadians their basic human rights. But I also want to show how those failures never deterred the Japanese Canadian community from drawing on a deeper set of constitutional values and to push for constitutional change on the basis of those values. They held Canada to account for its own constitutional failures in a significant and lasting way. It sets, of course, an important foundation of our democracy. But the reason Section 3 exists is because of its history of its denial in Canada, including women, Indigenous peoples, Chinese Canadians, and Japanese Canadians. Tomokichi Homa's constitutional story is the best known of my cases this evening, and I'm really honored that some of his family members are.
Okay, so we'll start now, 2:10. And thank you everyone for coming out. We're a little late to start, but really appreciate you coming out in this way. Actually, I'm the president.
Kimi Kai.
Yosh Inoue.
Ron Shimizu, Secretary.
Michelle Walters.
And regrets from Randy and Janet Sakawe. They're both, Toku. They are going to be part of the discussion. Derek Sakawe. And Koji Takahashi. And Midori Takahashi. And Stefan Hamade. So, is that it? Oh yeah, and then Michelle will also be a participant in the discussion in the past 2 years. And also we want to make the budget items align with our purposes that we'll be submitting. We haven't received actually the bill for the memberships yet, so that's why it's not showing up. But in fact, it could end up costing actually more than $7,000 just to 30 members that have renewed. And that's, I think, about maybe 60%, something like that. And our membership actually has grown over the past 2 years since we've been holding more events. And I guess there was a time in one of the reasons why the Constitution needs to be reviewed is that the organization has changed a lot. I mean, at one point you must have had over 1,000, so many members, right? Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Now here we have the motion number 5 is to approve the appointment of Michelle Walters as secretary for 2020. Now, normally in our constitution, this is something that the executive committee decides at a meeting to be held shortly after the approval from the membership at a meeting. And also we were required to send you that information in the mail, all 2019 members. So, okay. Programs, and I'm just looking at the time. Programs and initiatives for 2020. Present this big but tiny check.
Thank you.
To Eric Hong, the Executive Director.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
So on behalf of Momiji Healthcare Society, I thank the NAJC for your continued support. As you well know, Momiji was established initially to serve the East Asia generation.
Well,
and our
now
mission
that
is to
he is
continue.
living in Momiji and we have our meetings here, it's really neat to have him here. So anyway, Soku, on behalf of the board and the members, thank you very, very much for your service.
Yeah, and maybe we could get a picture and
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just before you break up, my grandfather was Nisei. So that's the connection with us. So there are many generations of Yonseis, but the voices of Yonseis haven't been heard enough in our community because we often think, well, where are the Yonseis? And they are here. We are here. So it would be good to hear some of those voices. So the proposed theme was, where do we go from here? And I kind of broke that down into 2 different questions. One of which is, who are we? Who are we who are here? And where is here? So,
so one of the moments for me happened about 3 months ago. It's one that actually Lynn keeps on reminding me that happened, and I sometimes forget. There was an ad that was put forward by the People's Party of Canada on Facebook, where they used a picture from Internment. And I was just scrolling through Facebook. I was working on a political campaign for the NDP at the time. But
the Japanese Canadian community, as a result, or not as a result, but coincidentally, I am related to a lot of people in this room. I think that's something that I took for granted that is very special, but I didn't realize how rare and unique that was. June and I attended an event called Insoku, which was organized by the Kike Collaborative in Vancouver, which parallels.
So I think, first of all, we grew up in a city and in a place where diversity was accepted, or a city and a time, I should say, where diversity was accepted. And so I never felt ostracized or teased or isolated or anything like that, even though I didn't grow up with
When I went to the JET program, or went on the JET program, I was also an ALT, and actually in the same prefecture that Midori was in. And I think before going to Japan, it was a very similar experience. Like, I knew I was half Japanese, but I didn't really feel.
Michelle, what is your defining moment of being American?
It's an interesting question. So I'm answering it a little bit differently, I think. I think that the first moment that there was something going on with my childhood, normal childhood, grew up in New Jersey for the most part, had parents, went to school, whatever. The same story, I think, as most kids. But then first day of 6th grade, the teacher asked everyone to stand up and say, where are your parents from, your mother, your father, and what do they do for a living? And so I stood up and I said, my dad's from Nashville, and my mom's from Japan, and he's an engineer, and she's a homemaker. And everyone just sort of looked at me, and I realized.
The Canadian Japanese Hockey League is the George Bell Arena Junction.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a 4-team house league, so they try to balance the teams.
But JCC has a thriving judo group there. Are there a lot of Yonseis and Goseis, fifth generation Japanese, taking judo there, or are the Caucasian people there because they're interested in judo, not connected?
Defining moment of what it means for us to be Canadians or Americans of Japanese ancestry, and how do we see or not see our story reflected in the community as it is today. And we've seen the diversity of voices and the diversity of our cultures and our histories, so there are many different stories, but we riff off the same narrative that is rooted in culture, in history, in identity, and our way of being community, which is very scattered because of our history. But there's a